Talking to Mr. Charles Dungey, who is the professor at Tennessee State University in the Department of Music and with the Jazz Ensemble. Mr. Dungey, I think before we had our first break, we were talking about the influences to African-American music, not only being Africa, but also Europe and other traditions and et cetera.
Yes.
Let's give you an opportunity during the second segment to develop that as a theme.
Well, we will sort of put everything under the heading of jazz, since that is an accepted term, considering the art form, all right? Now, the contributors were those people that were practitioners, musicians of several types. The black entity to music came from those musicians that oftentimes were in waif homes, such as Louis Armstrong, or were in an organization that played marching music, marching band music. Now, the development of their skills on different instruments had to come from those people, Europeans, that offered an opportunity for blacks to play these various instruments. Once the instrument was established and the learning process was over, of course, they started putting their input, interpretation of how they wanted the music to go, you see. So it was a culmination of different cultures here. And that's what we have to understand before we can even start thinking about what developed later on. Now, getting back to the Africans' contribution, a lot of people do not research a particular instrument, the violin, before Europeans introduced it in their arena. Africans had a violin long before the violin reached Europe. Yes, yes. It started up around Egypt, I think, you know. But this shows you that it was not just an instrument coming from a people that had, you know, didn't know what they were doing in the whole business. Certainly, they knew what they were doing, but at the same time, they were helping to produce this wonderful art form that we do call jazz. Now, with the development in New Orleans, jazz traveled. It went upriver, the Mississippi, the mighty Mississippi. Memphis, not so much, not in the early days. Chicago, Kansas City. Then we had white bands that had heard what the black bands were doing, and they developed their style of jazz music and took it to New York City, Chicago, and different locales in other parts of the country.
So in a real sense, the African-American music tradition is essentially the American music tradition,
yes,
which is
yes,
a combination of all of these traditions and all of these differences. Go on and explain. Go on.
Now, it is, but we have to understand that jazz is a black music tradition. It started with blacks first. Then the development happened when whites developed, not developed, but discovered this wonderful, wonderful idea of improvisation and getting musical ideas across. Sometimes in my jazz history class, I often bring up the question for the students, do you think Johann Sebastian Bach would have made a good jazz musician. I have gotten various answers to this, and one is Mr. Dungy, he may have been a jazz musician. Thought.
He might have been.
Thought he may have been, but I'm not going to push that.
Okay,
Now, I'm not saying that, that Clark was a jazz musician, but you see, jazz is an art form not to be taken lightly.
You know, one of the problems that we have dealing with the musical tradition from my own perspective, that when you talk about this period, this era in American history where we talk about the era of the big bands and whatnot, what relationship existed between such personalities as Glenn Miller and Duke Ellington? And I mean, was there very much cooperation or between those kinds of bands?
There was a mutual admiration society going on. For instance, Bix Beiderbecke was a well-known white trumpeter. He loved Louis Armstrong's playing, and Louis admired Bix. In fact, they would go if the two of them were playing in the same town on intermissions. Pops would go and listen to Bix, and in turn, Bix would come and listen to him, you know, and they would copy each other's licks and things, and, you know, that was all part of it. Paul Whiteman listened often to Duke Ellington's music. So many people did. Duke admired several bands of that time, and even later on, because he spoke favorably of a lot of white organizations that he had admiration for. So yes, but you see, here again, that's how the two cultures interplay with each other. That's one of the points I was making earlier when we started this discussion, that the two cultures, you see, had this interplay.
Very good. You know, and of course, Mr. Dungy, we're coming up to the second commercial break now, and when we come back, we'll have about 6 minutes, and we'll give you an opportunity to continue this discussion, but I'm simply encouraged by the relationships that you're bringing out between the African-American music tradition and the American music tradition, and we'll be back with our audience following this short commercial break.
All right.
The show for today